Alright, we just got some digging done here. I'll show you that here in a minute. I regraded right up next to where my shop was at. Basically did the rough grading with the excavator and did a little grading with the tractor for finish grading. What I wanted to go over with today, if you're kind of new to excavators, you're thinking about buying one, you're thinking about renting one, I'm just going to kind of go over real quick operation, what to look for, some things that may help you out, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with one. So number one, just about every excavator is going to be two joystick version. Generally there's two variants. Usually the people call them different things. I call it excavator mode or backhoe mode. Obviously I have the Massey Ferguson and I've run a backhoe probably just about as much as I've run an excavator, but unfortunately the first thing I sit down on was a backhoe, so I usually select the backhoe mode versus the excavator. That's just what I'm used to. So when you buy the machine, be sure almost every Bobcat, every John Deere that I've ever been on, every Caterpillar has that mode selector. A couple of the older Kubotas that I've been on actually had more than those two. But you want to get in a mode that, one, if you had to ask for help, somebody will be able to help you. And I would recommend, especially if you think you may buy a tractor and a backhoe at some point, or may use one, the backhoe seems to be a little more universal. For example, the Massey, there is no switch on it. It only works in backhoe mode. So if you can get on the excavator and flip it into backhoe mode, it'll be something that's recognizable. Give you a little bit more productivity, just because you'll be able to jump on the machine. It'll make sense. The big thing on excavators, I've seen people, especially if they've rented one, is they don't understand the purpose for this lockout. Even on my machine, I've had people jump on my machine and actually step around this rather than actually pulling it up. Please don't do that. So the problem is, especially with this zero clearance rear end, is everything's really compact. So your legs are bouncing up against these sticks, hitting this stick, and it's really easy if you're getting off the machine to bump into a control. And the whole purpose of this is to shut all the controls down so you can safely get off the machine. So that's probably number one, and that's pretty universal. Most Bobcat skid steers you get on, stuff like that, you got to lift the bar up. Same kind of concept here. You don't want the machine to move on you while you're trying to get off of it. There's a lot of stuff down there that can pinch you. So with the machine running and you've got the controls down, most machines will move backwards and forwards. I try to tell most people, I see a lot of people that literally will run their excavator with their hands and they never use the foot pedals. If you're renting a machine or even using a machine, you will put less time on that excavator if you can become more efficient. That's pretty much the name of the game with these, is to become really efficient. So I would really recommend at least practicing a little bit with the pedal controls. I don't always use them, but 90% of the time if I'm moving, I'm using the pedal controls. With the exception of maybe like long transports, because on this particular machine, you're cramped up enough to where your feet kind of get at an awkward angle and you get tired if you had to go a long distance. In backhoe mode, basically it works exactly like a backhoe. Your dipper stick, and I'm not going to go over all of the controls. Take a look at your machine. My particular machine up here kind of gives you like a quick cheat sheet to know what's going to do what. I don't know that I've ever looked at that. You kind of figure it out once you get on it. But that's something that comes with practice. Now, so these control basically the boom and the controls. Bobcat, which I've run quite a bit, usually they'll put a thumb control over on the right hand side. On my machine, it's actually down here in the floor. It's actually a foot pedal, and there's an identical foot pedal on the right hand side that will actually angle the boom. And I see a lot of people that do not use that feature. Especially if you're doing trench work or drainage work, super useful, because what it's designed to do, if you look at your pivot point in front of you, it lets you line your boom up in a dead line, so you can dig like really close to a house where you normally couldn't dig because you're offset, or if you're just out digging and you had to put your track somewhere up on a ditch or something, and you need to get this boom in line with the ditch, it allows you to do that. And a lot of times what I notice is I'll basically use the foot controls backing up while I'm kind of still lining up the boom, and if it gets out of alignment, as soon as I stop, I just reach over, realign the boom with the ditch. And I'll kind of give you, I'll do a little thing here at the end of the video where I'll show some of this in practice. Most excavators, you know, you got a throttle control usually over on your right, sometimes they're a dial, and you've got your blade. Now when I operate the blade, almost all the time I actually have my boom at a 90-degree angle to my tracks. And the reason being, if you do a lot of this looking back or anything like that, if your blade's behind you or even in front of you, you just can't see it as well. If you turn the excavator around and you know, be mindful of trees and stuff, because keep in mind that boom's going to be hanging off the side and you're going to be looking somewhere else. It just makes it a lot easier to grade. Mini excavators aren't dozers, but you can do quite a bit with them, and I've done quite a bit with this one. Back blading, I'll show you that here in a second. One thing, if you're renting an excavator or even buying one, if you look at that blade and the blade section doesn't come below the frog of the blade, I'll show you what that is here in a minute. You will have a really tough time, especially if you want to do back blading operations, to get something really smooth. Simply because the blade really definitely can't cut going backwards, because it's going to be riding on the big surface of the blade. And the forward cutting is not nearly as good, because basically the blade works based off the weight of the blade, and obviously if you've got more of the blade touching the ground before you ever start cutting, it's not going to dig in. So I've replaced the one on this one, and that made a huge difference. When I bought it, it was wore right down to the frog, and it would do okay going forward, but it wasn't like super level. Now I can basically get it within finish grade and just literally drag the tractor blade over it once at an angle and get it really level, which has been nice. Obviously with any equipment, the number one thing that I've had trouble with excavators is basically hoses. Everything else is pretty durable, especially these upper hoses that if you're doing land clearing or something like that, it's pretty easy to yank a fitting loose or a hose loose. Big thing on digging, I've heard a lot of different things, talked to a lot of different engineers. On the bigger machines, there is a particular way you should dig as far as in reference to your track motors. The mini excavators, that doesn't necessarily apply, and generally you're going to get the most digging force if you've got the blade in the rear and you've got it down on the ground. That's actually going, it's kind of counterintuitive, because you think it's going to, I guess, not pick up the machine as much, but the reality is the bigger you can get your base in the back, the more force you can actually put against the ground. If you're pushing down on the machine and that blade's back there, it's basically like a lever. It actually makes the machine, I guess, weigh more because it's on a lever, and it will dig better. So that's typically how I dig, with the exception of if I've already got loose dirt. Usually I'll go ahead and spin around somewhere in the middle of the dig to go ahead and get the blade where I can kind of start doing fill in or etc. But usually if I'm digging in hard dirt, one tip is actually flip the machine around, put the blade behind you. You'll actually get more digging force. Now yes, a lot of people do kind of pull dig and try to use that blade to stop them, but in my experience, especially if the hole is close to you, all you're going to do is, you're going to doze a little bit of dirt forward and it's going to move anyway. But if you'll put that back there and actually, try to dig down and, try to shave in the hard stuff rather than trying to pull it back to you, it usually works a lot better, and you're actually able to put a lot more force. The big thing is too, it's a little bit less wear on the machine because you're kind of keeping everything in line and putting force on everything rather than actually pulling against a lot of long metal pieces, because that's what you're doing when you're pulling back. So just a tip, and try it. If you don't believe me, just give it a try, and you'll see that it actually makes the machine, you got a bigger lever, it weighs more. It's going to put more bucket force on your dig downward. If you rent one of these machines or buy one, highly, number one thing, recommend a thumb. If you haven't seen my grading bar video where I basically just took a piece of straight lumber and screwed a couple of pieces together, you can grab that with a thumb and turn that into basically, a 6-foot blade that you can lessen up pressure, and you can kind of let it ride at the level you want, and you can rake. It's not the equivalent of a a hydraulic grading bucket, but it's pretty darn close, and it costs a lot less money. You don't have to swap out buckets, but just something to think about there, especially if you're going to do land clearing, or even just grading in general. It's a lot easier to grab a root or something with a thumb. You have to do less digging to get that out with a thumb. It's just a lot quicker, and it makes a lot of sense. Generally, every rental machine I've got recently has had one on it. This machine didn't have one on it, but the number one purchase decision on this machine was how hard was it to add. It already had plumbed hydraulics. Another thing to think about if you're going to use like a breaker or thumb, etc., make sure the machine has options for full hydraulic flow to like a breaker before you get it, because they do this one in particular, and most other machines have two settings. You either get a bidirectional valve or you have full flow one direction for like a breaker. So you'll want to make sure that matches up with whatever attachment you're going to want to use. And if you're buying a machine, I found a lot of the Whacker Newsons that did not have that option. They were full flow auxiliary hydraulic, so they could run a breaker, but you were going to have to add components that were fairly expensive out on the boom to get a thumb or something installed. So try to get a machine if you can that have both options. Another big thing on these particular machines with this, the zero clearance in the back, basically that means you can spin the machine around and the rear of the machine doesn't hang over the tracks. So every Kubota that I've had that was standard, the battery was easily accessible in the back. On these machines, it's actually underneath your footwell here, and you have to take out a bunch of metric screws that several of them have broken off on this machine. I've had to replace them. But it's not somewhere you can just get hook jumper cables to. So that's one thing to consider, especially if you're going to leave the machine somewhere you can't necessarily jump it off easy. A little bit harder to work on, a little bit harder to get the stuff when you get into these smaller machines that are compact. Okay, so I'm going to move the camera. The first thing I'm kind of going to show you is kind of how to do this boom. If you're digging a ditch back towards you and you want to line, and you can't always run your tracks parallel to that, especially if you're running around obstacles. So I'm going to kind of pretend that there's an obstacle and show you how you would line that boom up. I don't know how well it'll come on camera, but I'm going to use my track prints here as the imaginary ditch and kind of show you how to line that up. So hopefully that made sense. I kind of simulated, crossing over my ditch, getting upside of my ditch, but I was basically having to position myself around this tripod. And what I was doing was basically getting my track stable and then reconfiguring the boom where I was getting a straight on dig where my imaginary trench was going to be. If you ever have run into that before, a lot of times I'll see people actually trying to dig the ditch, and especially if it's a rental and they've never used one before, they'll actually come into the ditch, get off center off of where they wanted their line, and they're always digging in the wall. They're basically trying to dig at a little chomps back rather than nice smooth motion. Because what you kind of want to get is the chroming effect on the bottom of the ditch. You want the bottom of the ditch to be smooth. You want sides of the ditch to be smooth. It'll be more stable, it'll be easier to backfill, and you're not moving as much material. Most importantly, you're more efficient. If you're renting a machine, the reality is they're even though it doesn't seem like it, you know, you're renting it for the day, more than likely they've got an 8-hour limit, so you're paying per hour. On a smaller machine, you're looking between $60 to $80 an hour. So it makes a big difference on being efficient with a machine. So that's one tip, especially if you're doing a water line or something like that. Be sure to always remember that boom offsets and will move around. I see a lot of people that never touch that feature, and it's there for a reason, and that's it. So the next time I'm going to show you, I'll build a road down the back side over here, and it's relatively steep. I've been to several excavator accidents where people have flipped over. A majority of them have been, they've started to go off a really steep area, especially when it was wet, and the tracks weren't in great shape, etc. Excavators will slide. Once they get going, they will keep on trucking. So always keep that in mind when you're about to go over something. Be prepared for what's going to happen. The other thing that I see a lot of people doing is they'll put their boom up and try to make the machine as compact as possible. That's usually not always best. You want to keep your machine compact, but if you're going down frontward, you definitely want that bucket to stop you if you were to try to tip over. Because once you reach a certain point, tipping over, it could roll either way. So if you've got the bucket and it's going to stop you, I've went down stuff. I go down stuff all the time, and use that bucket to basically brace. A lot of times it's not about to flip over, but the weight will shift to the point to where not a whole lot of pressure on the rear of the track, and the machine's kind of just tilting forward, and it's good to have that bucket in front of you and not, you know, off to the side or completely raised up and compacted up to where you couldn't get it down to the ground really quick if you needed to. But anyway, so I'm gonna go down this little steep embankment here and just kind of give you an idea. This is really steep. This is probably about as steep as anything I've been on, and it's a little wet and it's a little leafy, so you know, the excavator's not going to have great traction. It'll go back up it pretty easily, but you wouldn't want to like put your boom over the side and dig, because you could very easily and quickly pull the excavator off of the side of the bank. So that's another tip. Be mindful if you don't have good traction. When you stick that bucket down on the ground and you pull, bad things could happen if you know the excavator's going to move. If you've ever run one of these, there was one time we were putting in a basin, and we're almost right at finished. Basically trying to get everything finished graded and trying to get the dirt and the material up to the basin where the water would run in, and it came an absolute downpour. And I was on flat ground, but literally if you just stuck a tooth of that bucket into the ground and pulled, it would slide that excavator all over the place, and I really couldn't do anything. We kind of, you know, slopped a little bit of mud over the basin and let it do its thing, and then had to come back the next day and clean it up. Whew, thunder. So I'm gonna shoot this real quick. I'm gonna just go down a little ways just to give you an idea. Hopefully the steepness will come through on camera, and you can kind of see how I operate the excavator as I'm going down the steep part. All right, so hopefully that gave you an idea. That's pretty steep. That's steep enough for the actual tracks to spin. On that little road, there's not a lot of room for error. It's amazing how quickly you can get into trouble, especially if you get into like really wet dirt. You know, those tracks really move a lot of dirt, and they can just kind of move the dirt out from underneath you if you're not careful. But having using your feet controls, having your hands ready on that bucket, a lot of times that can save you. Like, coming up, it was a fairly fluid motion to actually climb that machine up out of there. And that's the main reason that I think it's a good idea. If you do run a machine, I think you should try to use those foot pedals or know how to use them, rather than what most people do is they never touch them and they just operate the sticks. The problem with having your hands on the sticks all the time is you can't control the boom. You can't control what's going on. Anyway, hope that helps some people out. If you got some tips, be sure to leave them down in the comments, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.